Okay, so I bought you defensive streamers of the week. Now let's go to the men under center at the quarterback position. I'm bringing you quarterbacks that you should be streaming going into the fantasy playoffs for weeks 15, 16, and 17. Keep in mind, yes, I'm going to be covering those weeks, and maybe in your league, your fantasy playoffs maybe starts at week 14, which we don't recommend because there's a lot of teams that are on bye week still in week 14 and or week 17, where a lot of teams do rest their players. We don't recommend that either. But once again, covering weeks 15, 16, 17 of the fantasy playoffs. Let's get straight into it with a little bit of information before I get to my three top streaming options so far for the quarterback position. As you can probably see on your screen now, there is a list of players and teams. These are my top 10 teams in order that currently give up the most points to the quarterback position. So ranking 1 to 10, the top teams that currently give up a lot of points to the quarterback position: the Chargers, the Commanders, the Bucks, the Eagles, the Bears, the Broncos, the Falcons, the Cardinals, the Dolphins, and the Jacksonville Jaguars all currently give up the top 10 most points to the quarterback position. And I've broken down by each and every week, as you can see, the names underneath their teams of players and quarterbacks that currently play those teams within the fantasy playoffs in weeks 15, 16, and 17. And before I actually get into my streams of the week for the fantasy playoffs, I did want to bring you some honorable mentions. Some people that, hey, you may be in deeper leagues, you may be in sharp leagues, and you may not be able to pick up some of the guys that I may be mentioning or maybe even trade for, right? You may have to pivot to different options. But here are some honorable mentions. And some of these players were mentioned twice in this list and have two good matchups, that have two top 10 matchups going into the fantasy playoffs. Obviously, Kyler Murray, I doubt you can get Kyler Murray, but he's been here in this matchup twice. He's playing the Eagles in week 14 and the Bears in week 16. Week 17 in the Eagles, in week 16 for the Chicago Bears. So really good matchups for Kyler Murray. Obviously, Lamar Jackson has a good matchup. Of course, Zach Wilson is also somebody else that I'm not excited to start, but who has two top 10 matchups going into the fantasy playoffs. Not somebody I'm excited to start. Same thing with Bryce Young, two top 10 matchups in the top 10. But here are my true honorable mentions that say, hey, maybe these guys are on waiver wires. Maybe you are in a one quarterback league and you don't really trust. Maybe you have a quarterback that has a top 10 worst playoff schedules going into the fantasy playoffs. Aiden O'Connell in week 15 playing the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers currently give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, we saw Aiden O'Connell step in the last time when he played against the Los Angeles Chargers. Obviously, Jimmy G went down and he kind of took over and he drove the ball all the way down, and he didn't score. Unfortunately, he almost got that win, but we saw what he did against my beloved New York Giants, and he was cooking him, right? So maybe that is something that we can look out for if you are in a pickle. Derek Carr, week 16 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That is somebody else I'm also very interested in. A divisional game that anything can happen. He is one of the leading top deep ball throwers currently in the NFL right now, meaning any one of these games, especially for Derek Carr, he can have over 300 yards and 3-4 touchdowns, all to Raheed Shaheed going into the fantasy playoffs. Obviously, a bit of a risk, but keep that in mind. And last but not least, Matthew Stafford in week 15 versus the Washington Commanders, who currently give up the second most points to the wide receiver position. This is probably one of my favorite streams of the week here. My favorite bonus honorable mention streams of the week is Matthew Stafford with week 15 matchup going into the fantasy playoffs. But enough with that. Let's get straight into my top 3 streamers for the fantasy playoffs. Okay, going into my first streaming option of this week, going into week 15 of the fantasy playoffs here. Let's start off with Gino Smith at the Philadelphia Eagles, and this is something that we have to really keep in mind. A lot of people are saying, well, the Eagles, they haven't really been good this year. You're right, they haven't been good. They've been giving up a lot of points to fantasy quarterbacks, fantasy wide receivers, because they're struggling at the secondary. They have been great in the front four. They've been getting pressure like it's nothing, but the secondary hasn't been great. And here are the past 2 games. Listen to this. In the past 2 games, the Eagles against the Washington Commanders, 473 yards they gave up in total. Against the Dallas Cowboys in week 9, 406 yards. That is 878 yards they have given up in 2 games. Nearly almost 900 yards they gave up to an offense that no one was expecting to kind of do with them in the Washington Commanders. And I would say, you know what, that makes sense for the Dallas Cowboys for, them to put up over 400 yards on them in total as an offense. They did both win that game, the Philadelphia Eagles. But when you think of Gino Smith, when you think of the weapons that he has, you would genuinely have to say that this offense on paper is probably better than the Washington Commanders and the Dallas Cowboys. You think of their team. You think of Kenneth Walker, Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and the rookie sensation in Jackson Smith and Jigba. There's a lot of offensive weapons that this team has to go up against to the Philadelphia Eagles specifically to kind of lock down. Now, the offensive line may be a little bit of a problem. That is fair, right? I completely understand that. But you have to think of this matchup here in week 15 as a shootout, a back and forth with Jalen Hurts, with Geno Smith, and both of these defenses potentially struggling going into week 15. So Geno Smith versus the Philadelphia Eagles is my first streaming quarterback for the fantasy playoffs. Going into week 15 of the fantasy playoffs, my next streaming quarterback here, I don't think a lot of people are going to like this, depending on which side you're on. That is Justin Fields versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Arizona Cardinals currently, as I'm recording this, give up the 8th most points to the quarterback position. Yes, Kyler Murray is going to be back, and I think this actually helps Justin Fields in his argument. Now, my second thing is, yes, Justin Fields is injured. My expectation is that he is going to be back for the fantasy playoffs. He should be back actually going into week 11 or 12 of the fantasy season, which once again, you should see him really, in my opinion, take the next step. We saw that a little bit in glimpses in the first 5 weeks of the season. Yes, he struggled in the first 2 games, and then we saw him progress as we were hoping and expecting, but then he got injured. Remember, weeks 1 to 5, he was a top 3 quarterback for fantasy before his injury. Not only that, he was a top 4 rushing quarterback in weeks 1 to 5 for fantasy. And there's no doubt in my mind that in the rushing category specifically, he would have continued to rush and have been a top 5 or top 3 quarterback so far going into 10 weeks of the season. But that is not the case. He is injured. Tyson Baggett, I like to call him. He is starting currently right now. But Justin Fields, my expectation that he is going to be back. This should be a high-scoring game as well with Kyler Murray back, and you have to think of the struggles that this defensive side of the ball is going to be seeing with Kyler Murray and Hollywood Brown, but also how of the defensive side for the Arizona Cardinals should be struggling with Justin Fields' legs and with DJ Moore on the other side. So keep that in mind. I would say this. If somehow Justin Fields does not start or like not trending in the right direction, then he is somebody obviously you're going to have to pivot off of, and then maybe you comment down below and say, hey, he is not an option anymore. But I am projecting that he is going to be back. I am projecting he is going to be healthy and so on and so forth. Not only that, guys, you have to understand the Chicago Bears have to understand what they have with Justin Fields. They haven't seen a full season with him, unfortunately. He got injured. And look, maybe they are going to move on from him, but maybe they need to showcase what Justin Fields can do before they go out and say, you know what, I want Caleb Williams or Drake May with one of those 2 top picks that they have from the Carolina Panthers and their own as well. So keep that in mind. Justin Fields versus the Arizona Cardinals going into week 16 of the fantasy playoffs. Going into the fantasy championships, week 17, this is where you get that money pot, where you hopefully get crowned champion, and you need a quarterback, and you're saying, who is my streaming quarterback for week 17? That is Brock Purdy versus the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders currently give up the 2nd most points to the quarterback position, and this is something that you have to really understand. You have to say Brock Purdy. By the way, he probably is going to be rostered in the majority of leagues. But if you're in a 1 quarterback league and he's available, he was available, I think, going into week 7 of our home league. I picked him up. I dropped him again, and then somebody else picked him up. That was my mistake. If you are in one of those leagues where maybe you're in a 10-man league, maybe you're in a 12-man league, and 1 quarterback, and Brock Purdy's available, I think this is somebody you should be picking up and maybe or trading for, because not only does Brock Purdy have week 16 as a good matchup, he also has week 15 as a good matchup, just as another throw in there for you guys. He's playing the Arizona Cardinals in week 15. So he has 2 out of 3 matchups here in the top 10 for Brock Purdy. But specifically for week 17, Brock Purdy versus the Washington Commanders, we all know how bad the Commanders are. We've seen teams throw all over the Washington Commanders. They have struggled in the secondary. They have willingly given up, their 2 top, defensive players, and Chase Young and Montez Sweat no longer on the team. They've been getting a lot of rookies in the secondary as well. They're averaging over 368 yards to opposing teams, either on the air or on the ground. And Brock Purdy with this team, if they're trying to find the rhythm, if they're going to be firing on all cylinders for the fantasy playoff, or for the NFL playoffs, for the real playoffs, they're going to have to be showing some, practicing some plays versus the Washington Commanders in week 17. All due respect to the Washington Commanders, but you're going to have Deebo Samuel back. Hopefully he's healthy. Brandon Ayuk, hopefully he's healthy. Christian McCaffrey with the screen that can go for, 80 yards in any given play. That's exactly what you want to see. George Kittle as well. You have playmakers all over for the offensive side of the ball, and Brock Purdy is going to be feasting on that when you think of going into the fantasy championship. Currently QB 13. He is coming off his bye week. Obviously, he has been a top quarterback, although a top 10 quarterback so far in the first 9 weeks of the season. So once again, that bye week did hinder him going just outside the top 10 and being a top 13 quarterback so far right now. But I can easily see that progressing and him being harder and harder to get. So as of right now, if he is rostered in somewhere and you're saying, hey man, maybe I need to get him. Maybe I have, Jordan Love, or maybe I have a Trevor Lawrence, or maybe I have a Gino Smith that I brought earlier today. Maybe I have a Jared Goff that, that does maybe have tough matchups. These are some people, someone like a Brock Purdy, that I'm going to be trying to acquire and say, hey, 2 out of the 3 matchups in the fantasy playoffs, and I'd rather be taking the chance in week 16 against the Baltimore Ravens, which should be either a tough matchup or a high-scoring matchup for Brock Purdy. He is somebody that I'm willing to get on my roster for the fantasy championship. So week 15, Gino Smith versus the Eagles. Week 16, Justin Fields, versus the Arizona Cardinals. And week 17 in the fantasy championship, Brock Purdy versus the Washington Commanders. Guys, hopefully that is helpful. I'm going to be continuing the series with some maybe running backs and wide receivers and tight ends that you can pick up waiver wires and or flex if you are struggling with injuries currently right now. We appreciate each and every one of you, and as always, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh,
it's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.